sources that go way beyond like just tweaking the timeline or, just location a bit.
Okay.
One of your sources argues that Buddha might have been Sri Lankan, which just totally upends, the widely accepted view of his life taking place in what's now Nepal and India.
Whoa. Okay, so you're telling me everything we think we know about where Buddha was born, where he lived, achieved enlightenment, could be wrong.
Well, that is the question that these sources raise, and it gets really interesting when you start to look at the specific evidence that's presented.
Okay.
We're talking about things like the types of trees that are mentioned in relation to Buddha's life, the journey of the famous Chinese monk Fa Hin, and even this concept of Asuras, which are these powerful beings from Sri Lankan lore.
All right, I'm hooked. Let's start with the trees. What kind of botanical mystery are we talking about?
Well, the cell tree is traditionally associated with Buddha's birth, and it thrives in tropical climates, close to the equator.
But the traditional birthplace of Buddha is in Lumbini, Nepal, which isn't exactly a tropical paradise.
Exactly. So this seemingly insignificant detail about a tree's, preferred habitat really starts to poke holes in the traditional narrative, like right from the start.
So if the sal tree is more common in a place like Sri Lanka, does that mean the whole story of Buddha's life might have been misplaced? That's a pretty huge implication.
It certainly raises that possibility. And to add another layer of intrigue, let's consider the journey of Fa Hin,
Okay.
a Chinese monk whose travels are often cited as proof of Buddha's connection to India.
Yeah, I've heard of Fa Hin. Didn't he write about visiting these important Buddhist sites in India?
He did, but here's where it gets interesting. Fa Hin documented very specific relics: Buddha's walking stick, a mark on his forehead, his sword, and his plate, all of which are currently located in Sri Lanka.
Wait, so if Fa Hin saw these relics firsthand, but they ended up in Sri Lanka, wouldn't that suggest that maybe the locations important to Buddha's life were originally in Sri Lanka too?
It certainly challenges the traditional interpretation of Fa Hin's travels, and some might say that the fact that Fa Hin doesn't mention crossing a sea to reach Buddha's land kind of discredits the Sri Lanka theory.
But isn't there that natural land bridge, the Rama Setu, that connected India and Sri Lanka in ancient times?
Yes, and that is a detail that is often overlooked.
Right.
The Rama Setu was 3 kilometers wide, meaning Fa Hin could have easily crossed it without even realizing he was technically crossing a part of the sea.
So if he didn't even notice he was crossing the sea, that pretty much throws out the argument that he couldn't have reached Sri Lanka, right?
Precisely. A deeper understanding of ancient geography can completely change how we interpret these historical journeys.
It's like those optical illusions where you swear you see one thing, but then you shift your perspective and boom, it's something completely different.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing here with this deep dive.
Yeah.
Shifting our perspective and questioning long-held assumptions about Buddha's life.
Okay.
Now, before we move on, there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to introduce that ties into this Sri Lankan connection, this concept of Asuras.
Okay, what are Asuras and how do they fit into all of this?
In Sri Lankan lore, Asuras are these powerful beings who achieve a kind of divine power through their own efforts and actions, challenging the traditional idea of gods and divine hierarchies.
So they're kind of like self-made divinities. That's pretty different from the usual image of gods just, being born with their power.
Exactly. And this idea of achieving extraordinary power through one's own efforts ties into some of the predictions that were made about Siddhartha before he became Buddha.
Oh, yeah. I remember something about predictions. Wasn't there a prophecy that he would either become like a great king or a Buddha?
Yes. And what's interesting is that this concept of a global king is far more prominent in Sri Lankan history and mythology, particularly with figures like Ravana.
Ravana. Wasn't he the king of Lanka in the Ramayana? The one with 10 heads?
That's him. Now imagine those predictions about Siddhartha being made in a culture where the idea of this powerful, world-ruling king like Ravana was already deeply embedded.
Oh, so you're saying those predictions might have been influenced by existing Sri Lankan archetypes and ideas about power?
It's a fascinating possibility.
Yeah.
It suggests that the story of Buddha's life might not have emerged in a vacuum, but was shaped by the existing cultural and spiritual landscape of the time, a landscape that could have been distinctly Sri Lankan.
So we've got these geographical clues, we've got the curious case of Fa Hin's relics, and now this connection to Sri Lankan mythology and archetypes. You've definitely given me a lot to think about.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Let's delve deeper into the story of Buddha's life, his teachings, and see how this Sri Lankan connection continues to play out.
All right, I'm ready to keep diving into this Sri Lankan connection. In part one, we talked about how geographical details and the journey of Falhine really challenge what we thought we knew about Buddha's life. And then there's this whole concept of Asuras, these self-made powerful beings that seems to tie into Sri Lankan lore. So what else can you tell me about Asuras and how they might relate to Buddha's journey?
What was fascinating about Asuras is they achieve their power through effort and willpower. They aren't born into some preordained role.
Yeah.
They challenge the established order.
Right.
Much like Buddha himself challenged the social and spiritual norms of his time.
So are you suggesting that Buddha himself might have embodied this Asura spirit, that he achieved enlightenment through his own, relentless pursuit?
It's certainly a thought-provoking idea, and it aligns with one of the most powerful stories about Buddha's life, the one about his passing.
Right.
Do you remember how Buddha asked Ananda 3 times if he should remain on Earth for an eon?
Yeah, and each time Ananda, who was under the influence of Mara, didn't respond, so Buddha chose to pass away. It's such a poignant story.
It is, and it really illustrates Buddha's strength and sovereignty.
Yeah.
He didn't cling to life even when given the opportunity to extend it indefinitely.
Yeah.
He chose his own path even in death.
Yeah.
Which really resonated with the Asura spirit, choosing one's destiny and wielding power over one's own existence.
This idea of Buddha as this powerful, self-determined being makes me think about some of the other things we discussed, like the fact that he might have been skilled in fighting. It challenges that common perception of him being solely gentle and peaceful.
Absolutely. There are stories from Siddhartha's youth that suggest he was quite skilled in combat and possessed a strong sense of justice. In fact, he is believed to have passed on those skills to Yashodhara.
It's fascinating to think about how those skills and that sense of justice might have actually helped him as a teacher later on.
Yeah.
Maybe he understood that true compassion isn't about being passive, but about having the strength to protect oneself and others.
That's a very insightful point. It suggests that Buddha was someone who could adapt to different situations, knowing when to be gentle and when to be firm.
Yeah.
His understanding of the full spectrum of human nature likely made him a more effective teacher.
It's like real strength comes from embracing both the light and shadow within ourselves, just as Buddha seemed to embody both gentleness and toughness.
And this brings us to another point that's often overlooked, Buddha's early life. We know that he was surrounded by luxury, orchestrated by his father, to deter him from a spiritual path.
Right. It seems like that plan backfired, though. Instead of turning him away from spirituality, being immersed in pleasure actually led him to seek something more meaningful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is mirrored in Buddha's teachings about the 2 extremes, which are referred to as Adhikilamata Anu and Kamasukala Kyanu.
Okay.
Adhikilamata Anu refers to self-mortification, the extreme asceticism that Buddha initially practiced. Kamasukala Kyanu represents the opposite extreme, indulging in sensual pleasures.
Got it.
Buddha explored both of these before finding the middle path.
So Buddha's own life was a journey from one extreme to the other, ultimately leading him to that balance of the middle path. It's a powerful lesson that we often have to experience the extremes to truly appreciate that middle ground.
Precisely. And it's something that the 2 chief disciples of Buddha Sariputta and Moggallana also went through.
Okay.
Before becoming monks, they spent 7 days indulging in worldly pleasures.
It's interesting how those who achieve such high levels of spiritual understanding still started out as ordinary people with desires and attachments.
It highlights the fact that enlightenment isn't about denying our human nature or suppressing our desires. It's about understanding those desires,
Right.
seeing their limitations, and choosing to focus our energy on something more fulfilling and lasting.
So it's not about repressing those desires, but about making a conscious choice to align our lives with what truly matters.
Exactly. And it seems like Sariputta and Moggallana, after experiencing those 7 days of indulgence, came to that realization on their own.
Okay, let's shift gears for a bit and go back to those predictions about Siddhartha becoming either a global king or a Buddha.
Yes. And remember how we discussed that the concept of a global king is much more prominent in Sri Lankan history and mythology? Well, there's another layer to this that I think you'll find intriguing. There are 4 sacred sites that Buddha instructed his followers to visit. Places he said would be in a straight line and at equal distances.
I remember reading about those sites. Aren't they traditionally considered to be in India and Nepal?
Yes, but those locations don't quite fit the description of being in a straight line. And at equal distances, however, there are potential sites in Sri Lanka that align much better with Buddha's instructions.
So are you suggesting that the true sacred sites might actually be in Sri Lanka? And if so, how did those locations get lost or forgotten?
Those are excellent questions, and it raises the possibility that this history, this Sri Lankan connection, might have been intentionally obscured or suppressed over time.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim, but if those sites in Sri Lanka are the true locations, it would certainly add weight to the idea that Buddha's life unfolded there.
It would indeed, and there's one more intriguing detail about these sacred sites that I want to share with you. The concept of Sangvedi Upadavagan is often associated with these sites.
What does Sangvedi Upadavagan mean?
It's often interpreted as a call to mourn or feel sorrow at those sacred sites.
Okay.
However, that interpretation might be a bit too simplistic if we consider that sadness is a form of attachment. It doesn't quite align with the core of Buddha's teachings.
That's true. Buddha's teachings are all about letting go of attachments, not clinging to them, even in the form of sorrow.
Exactly. So a more nuanced understanding of Sangvedi Upadavagan might be that those sites weren't meant to be places of mourning, but rather places to cultivate awareness, insight, and a heightened state of mindfulness.
So instead of dwelling in sadness, those sites could actually be places of deep contemplation and connection to Buddha's teachings.
Precisely. It's like they were meant to be gateways to a deeper understanding of his message, not just memorials to his passing. And if those sites are indeed in Sri Lanka, it raises even more questions about how that history has been preserved or perhaps lost over time.
This is getting really intriguing. You've given me a lot to think about, especially this idea that there might be a whole layer of Buddha's story that's been hidden or forgotten.
And we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore, so many more questions to ask as we continue to delve into this alternative narrative about Buddha's life and legacy.
Okay, I'm still reeling from that revelation about those sacred sites potentially being in Sri Lanka. It really makes you wonder what else we might have gotten wrong about Buddha's life.
Well, it's definitely a game changer, and it gets even more fascinating when you consider why that history might have been obscured. We've talked about political agendas, cultural shifts, and just the natural ebb and flow of time that can kind of bury certain truths.
But you're saying there could be something more deliberate at play? Like someone wanted to hide this Sri Lankan connection?
It's certainly a possibility worth considering. You know, think about it. If people don't know the true locations of these sacred sites, if they're clinging to a narrative that places those sites elsewhere, they're missing out on a potentially powerful experience.
It's like being given a map with crucial landmarks mislabeled. You might wander around for ages never finding the treasure you're seeking.
Exactly. And speaking of treasures, let's revisit that concept of Sangvedi Upadavagan for a moment.
Okay.
We talked about how it's often interpreted as a call to mourn at those sacred sites, but that interpretation might not capture the full depth of Buddha's intention.
Right, because sadness and mourning are forms of attachment, which seems to contradict the core of Buddha's teachings about letting go.
Precisely. So what if Sangvedi Upadavagan is less about mourning and more about cultivating a heightened state of awareness and insight at those sites?
So those sites could actually be places of deep contemplation and connection to Buddha's teachings, not just places to grieve his passing.
Exactly. It's like tapping into a hidden current of wisdom that's been flowing through those sites for centuries. And if those sites are indeed in Sri Lanka, it adds another layer to this idea of a history that has been intentionally obscured.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If this alternative narrative about Buddha being Sri Lankan is so compelling, why hasn't it gained more traction? Why is the traditional narrative still so dominant?
Well, for one thing, dominant narratives have a way of becoming self-perpetuating. You know, once an idea takes hold, it's hard to dislodge it even when evidence points in a different direction.
It's like those optical illusions where you see one image so clearly that you miss the other image hidden within it. We become so fixated on what we think we know that we fail to see other possibilities.
Exactly. And in this case, the traditional narrative about Buddha being from India or Nepal has been the dominant story for so long that it's overshadowed this Sri Lankan alternative.
But the fact that we're having this conversation, that you've brought these sources to light, suggests that the tide might be turning.
I believe it is. As more people question those long-held assumptions, as more evidence emerges, this Sri Lankan narrative will become harder to ignore.
And this isn't just about rewriting history books, right? It's about expanding our understanding of who Buddha was and what his teachings truly mean.
Absolutely. Embracing this alternative perspective opens up so many new possibilities for interpreting his life and legacy. It allows us to see Buddha as a more complex and multifaceted figure, one who embodies both strength and gentleness, wisdom and action.
It's like we're adding new dimensions to a painting we thought we already knew, revealing hidden depths and nuances that enrich the whole picture.
Precisely. And those nuances can deepen our understanding of the path to enlightenment, showing us that it's not a one-size-fits-all journey, but a process of self-discovery and growth that can take many forms.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how much there is still to learn and explore. We've just scratched the surface of this alternative narrative, and I have a feeling that this conversation is far from over.
I completely agree. This deep dive has raised more questions than it has answered, but that's the beauty of it. It's an invitation to keep digging, to keep questioning, and to stay open to new possibilities as we continue to explore the mysteries of history and the timeless wisdom of Buddha's teachings.
So to everyone listening out there, keep those questions coming, keep those minds open, and don't be afraid to challenge those assumptions, even the ones that seem rock solid. Who knows what amazing discoveries await us when we dare to dive deeper.